Hi, everyone. So, welcome back to another episode of the segment. This time around, I am so excited to be speaking to Brian Boetig. Now, Brian has quite a storied career. 35 years of national security, public safety, and consulting experience, including as an FBI assistant director, a United States diplomat, a CIA liaison officer, state, municipal, and university police officer, and a partner with an international business advisory firm. He's currently the principal advisor at Global Trace, a bespoke advisory firm. So that's a lot of three-letter acronyms that he's been involved with. And I'm really excited to see sort of what stories he's able to share with us today. Brian, welcome to the segment.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was very nice for the invitation, and I look forward to sharing some of the stories that have been told many times and some that maybe haven't been told or weren't as relevant as they were years ago that they might be under today's environment.
Fantastic! We can't wait. So it's interesting. So just as we're recording this, Brian, I'm sort of hooked to a particular a podcast I've discovered recently. The Rest is Classified, which is hosted by I think one like an ex British Secret Service agent and I think a former US CIA agent. Right? It's fantastic. And just sort of just as they discuss various aspects of spycraft and some real missions. I found that really interesting. So, in fact, let's you say like share with us probably like a story that you can share from your experience. Why don't we start there to see how it's shaped you?
Well, I will tell you one of the stranger stories that I have relates to one time when I was in D.C. This was actually pre 9/11 with Robert Hansen.
Mhm.
And Robert Hansen was the FBI spy who recently just died in prison, but was convicted and sent to prison for life. But he was turning over information to the Russians, and the story's probably not going to go where you think it's going. But my wife and I were in D.C. walking our dachshund. This was before we had children, and a gentleman came up to me, and he also had a dachshund. He wanted to breed this dachshund. So my wife had a conversation with him while I sort of ignored the whole conversation, and then she told me about this conversation. I was sitting in the park while she was walking, and thought nothing of it till I got home. And again, this is early. This is 2000. This was pre. This was right after Robert Hance was arrested, but pre 9/11. And I got home and I had three calls on my caller ID box from the Russian Federation, which is basically the Russian embassy. It turns out the guy with the dachshund was a Russian that worked at the embassy, and all I could think was during this Robert Hansen era when there was increased scrutiny on people that now I was tied up in this event with the Russians, which they're now calling my house, and I'm figuring what type. So I had to go back and report this to the FBI, and it was really funny because I took their guidance and I asked them what I was supposed to do, and they said, "Well, let's keep this going." And so I found myself the next weekend walking my dog in front of the Russian embassy, back and forth, and I just kept thinking, everybody is watching this from the Russians, from the U.S. spy agencies. Somebody's only got to be protecting me. And it turned out to be one of just the most awkward situations because he then came and we went back to the park, and the dogs didn't quite engage like we wanted them to. There might have been possibly a language barrier. I don't know what it was, but it was just the timing of everything, and many of your listeners probably remember the caller ID box, and just coming back and seeing those at a time when there was just increased scrutiny and heightened awareness around the Russians, which hasn't stopped in when I was stationed over in London. We had the nerve agent attack with
Yeah.
Novichok. That was 2018, and you look at today with the Russian Ukraine war and where that
Mm.
sits, and sort of some of the U.S. engagement on that recently. So it's funny how the spy game never stops, and it can hit you at any time that you least expect it.
Absolutely. Oh, that's brilliant. Well, what's all this sort of Russian American engagement? Oh, nothing. Our dogs
Yeah,
just want to breed. That's
I
all. It's just a dog breeding ring.
yes, and the hard part was I couldn't tell my wife what we were doing either. So that he had plans for the next weekend, but we'd already arranged to get back there. And I really just felt awkward just walking back and forth in front of the Russian embassy in DC, walking this dog and thinking at some point I'm going to pick up the dog and just throw it over the gate. It's going to run in there and do something. But just the spy game is just, it takes you on very weird twists that you would never expect. And a lot of these TV shows that you watch and think that's pretty unrealistic. I watch them sometimes, and maybe some of the dramatic elements of it are unrealistic, but nothing is too small to end up turning into some type of engagement or counterintelligence activity.
That's brilliant. Okay, Brian, I'm going to say right now, hands down, that is the best, not just intro that one of our guests has given us in now what will be the third season of the podcast, but also probably hands down the best story. So any of our former guests who are there, I challenge you to come on and share a more amusing and sort of crazy experience than that.
All it takes is buy a dachshund, and you end up in ridiculous situations like that.
That's brilliant. I mean, just going back to that podcast I was talking about, and in fact, it's based on the current episode I'm listening to is based on the book. I'm sure you've read, The $1 Billion Spy, and just the description in that of sort of the various bits of spycraft that they're trying to use in order to first engage with the asset and then exchange information. It's the creativity is incredible, right? It kind of like feels like games that kids play, right, in order to exchange information in one of the most sort of, I guess, tense theaters, or at that time in the 80s, in the world.
Yeah, the recruitment process is very, very creative, and you will spend weeks and months sometimes just role playing, engaging, and discussing an interaction that you just hope is a happenstance brush encounter somewhere
Hmm.
that's going to last less than 5 seconds, but sometimes you've put 5-6 months of work just into making sure
Hmm.
that happenstance brush encounter at a grocery store or in traffic is successful.
Yeah.
The amount of creativity, but also logistical work that goes into that is amazing.
Absolutely. So, I mean, because like particularly like when we see it on films and again, right, yeah, what we've consumed and sort of in the media and in books, right? So much of spycraft is actually like it's it's all those sort of the psychological and the physical contact, etc. How does that then, like, as the world is increasingly cyber, right, and spycraft moves into the cyber era, how does that change, like, how sort of the evolution of spycraft to sort of keep to pace with the cyber world?
What's interesting is there's still a very behavioral element even in cyber, and in the FBI, there's a group that everybody knows from watching decades of Criminal Minds, but the Behavioral Analysis Unit, and they have a group that specializes in cyber
Mm,
because even when you have people producing malware and other types of you know code that are in there's a signature in there that
mm,
the way people just like doing question document handwriting analysis, there's a signature in code, and different code writers will either advertently put in their name in there somewhere or something that identifies them, or they don't, but they don't do it advertently, but they're putting it in there subconsciously, the way that they write it, the way that you write the letter A on a written document, the same way someone would write that in code helps identify who they are. So there is a behavioral analysis element to reading code and scripts that are written that is it's a growing field that's just absolutely amazing.
mm. And then I guess it's also around like so that there's behaviors, and there's, as you say, that there's sort of those signatures, those telltale signs that attackers leave, but or helps identify them. But also, how have you noticed the tactics or the behaviors of cyber attackers evolve over the years?
There There's been a business model that's really been created out of cybercrime. When
Mm.
I look back to originally when a lot of the work that we were doing, the first cyber attacks were just website defacements,
Yeah.
which now seems so petty
Yeah.
and easy to absorb as a business. But it's really moved into a business model. I've been working ransomware for the last 10 years, both
Mm.
in the FBI and then as a consultant. And you have to realize that it's still human beings behind here, and they're
Yeah.
running a business. And it's the
Yeah.
same thing. My first assignment when I got into the FBI, I worked on the extraterritorial squad, which was one where we worked the extraterritorial jurisdiction of the FBI. People sometimes think I'm saying extraterrestrial, but it's extraterritorial. So outside of the United States where we have jurisdiction. So in countries where people are murdered or kidnapped, and the
Mm.
FBI has,
Mm.
the U.S. government has jurisdiction to investigate those. And we did a lot of kidnappings, for ransom. A lot of them, in Africa, where you knew which group would kidnap somebody
Mm.
and you knew exactly what they wanted. They would
Mm.
ask for $10 million, and you knew you could settle for five, and you get people back, unharmed.
Mm.
And just because you had intelligence, and this group would do it repeatedly to, American tourists, the same is what happens in ransomware these
Mm.
days. A ransomware happens, you go in, you figure out, okay, this is whatever group it may be, and okay, I've talked to all of my counterparts in the FBI or in the other advisory firms to understand this one. This is exactly how they're going to
Mm.
operate. Within 24 hours, they're going to send the follow-up email. They're going to threaten this. They're
Yeah.
going to ask for 10 million. Here's what other people are paying.
Mm.
When they pay, this is what happens. They either are done and clear as you can be in a ransomware, or then you're going to get the secondary, notice that now we've unlocked your computers, but now if you want us to destroy your data, so you understand the cycle. So it's really a business, and cybercrime has turned into a business
Mm.
model. You look at what North Korea. I mean, North Korea is raising funds through low level petty
Yeah.
cybercrime.
Yeah.
That's how they're funding their country at this point. So
Yeah.
I think of cybercrime really as a business, even in some of the stalking cases, or exes that are putting up dirty pictures of
Mm.
their private pictures of their exes and stuff like that. It's revenge. It's revenge, but there's also some level of business to it as well too. They're trying to get something out of this person, whether it's frustrate them more, or potentially get them to pay them money. So you have to really just I look at it as a business model, and that's the best way to sort of counter it.
That's really, yeah. That's really interesting, right? Because I think that you're then able to sort of almost replicate, or at least on the defender side, replicate that business model and sort of identify where it's best placed to essentially break the business, right? Or hinder that business. Like, where in that chain do you put your focus in order to stop them being productive? Is
And
that is
it's
that how you approach it?
I do, and if you think about it from a business model of being a criminal,
Mm.
it's so much safer.
Mm.
And if you were to break, I use this example quite often. If you were to break into a convenience store, in the UK, into a grocery store in Tesco, if you stole money from Tesco in the UK or 7-Eleven in the US, and you broke in and either physically robbed from the clerk, or when they weren't there, you went into the safe and stole $50, you'd have an army of police show up,
Mm.
because that's very comfortable to the police. And they'll take fingerprints, they'll interview, they'll pull video.
Yeah.
But if that same Tesco, that same 7-Eleven had somebody steal a $500,000, in cyber crime, from a cyber perspective, break in and steal, uh, you could call the police. And in most jurisdictions, the police are going to raise their hand and say, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
This isn't what we do. So if you're, I mean, of course, I'm not trying to give criminals advice here, but you're much more apt to get caught in the physical world than you are in the cyber world. It's a work from home job. You can
Yeah.
do it from your computer. So, and the challenge is you're victimizing people in the cyber world, which is geographic. In the
Yes.
physical world, you have to go someplace and go and do something. So you're pool of victims becomes the world as opposed to just the city or town that you live in,
Yeah.
or you don't have to travel and get someplace. So that's why you see smart organizations that traditionally were in outlaw motorcycle gangs. You've seen them move into cybercrime. They do a lot of
Mm.
still doing a lot of drugs and a lot of violence, but they're also doing cybercrime because it's safe and it produces money. So just an interesting world to do. But I always look at cybercrime first as a business
Yeah.
because it's easier to understand and then try to pick apart parts of that business that way.
Yeah, I agree, and I like the way your analogy of, or the way you said that cybercrime is the ultimate work from home business, right? You are, you can be very very far away from your, I guess ultimately what's going to generate your profit, very safe from it, but sort of keep taking it home every day,
Yeah,
right?
because I was a university, a city, and a state, police officer before I joined the FBI, and you're really focused on your jurisdiction. So
Mm,
when you have somebody who, and the same, in the UK is a little bit better with just 43 agencies and a little bit more coordination, but you've got 17,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States, and they're worried about things that are bleeding and
yeah.
things that are stolen physically from people's houses. And once it crosses from one city to another state somewhere else, it would drain the resources of a police
Yeah.
department to be able to do that. So there's just this dark underbelly of cybercrime that goes unenforced. And even the higher crimes, you don't have sometimes they don't meet the threshold for prosecution at the federal level. So if
Mm,
you stole, I used to the analogy I used to give, if you used to find 100 pounds of marijuana on the U.S. border, maybe in Montana or Idaho, that's a big case.
mm,
If you're the border patrol and you find 100 pounds of marijuana on somebody on the southern border, that's just like a warning, like, hey guys, pour that out, get rid of it. It's just
yeah.
each federal district and where the crime happens and the dollar value associated with it sort of drives the prosecution. So you're not going to in New York City, the Southern District of New York is probably not going to prosecute white collar crime for $50,000, $100,000. They probably have a $1 million
Yes.
threshold before they're even going to open a case. Which then, if you know where that sits, that's where you can operate and
Yeah.
really get work with impunity for the most part.
That, yeah, I really like the way sort of you express that, right? It when you're operating from a sort of, when you're targeting something from outside that jurisdiction, you almost not you're not evading law enforcement, but the cost of law enforcement to do something about it just gets so much higher, which means that you can almost do things repeatedly till it reaches that tipping point.
You
So
see it physically out in California, where they raised the bar of what you got arrested for shoplifting. It was like
yeah,
$950 or something like that. And everything else under that was just a ticket. Now, and so shoplifting went through the roof because everyone said,
yeah,
"Well, we can do it," and they're not going to do anything about it. So
yeah.
that's where we are in cybercrime. There's not enough people doing stuff about it. So
So do you think, like, so just on that subject then, right? I mean, I often get asked about, like, I feel it's almost every month there is some other article or a journalist says, oh right, like, okay, ransomware, should organizations pay up or refuse to pay, right? Um, and should they be fined if they pay? And should, like, so like, should we bring in place a law that says, never should ransomware be paid, a ransom be paid, right? Where do you sit on that?
when I was with the FBI, I wasn't able to sit on it. I wasn't allowed to tell, as we were working the cases, I wasn't allowed to give a business or an organization that guidance. They had to make that decision on their own. Then I switched over to doing some cybersecurity consulting, and I ended up in that place quite a bit. And I got to sit in the seats listening to the CEOs and
Mm,
CFOs driving those decisions. It really comes down individually. I don't think you can give a blanket because we
mhm.
had, we were working one case where a law firm had been the victim of a ransomware, and had they not paid, they would no longer be in existence.
Right, exactly.
their proprietary information, attorney-client information was taken, and so reputational damage of
Mm,
that being released, in addition to not having access to their information, they just, from a business perspective, they couldn't exist without that back,
mm,
and the only way that they felt like they could get it back was to pay the ransom. There's others that have done a better job of having backups and not. One of the worst things a company can do is just store data
yeah,
that that they no longer need, and just holding on to it, because then when you become the victim of some type of intrusion or ransomware, you have decades of data that you're
yeah,
now responsible for notifying millions of customers,
yeah,
or not, or ex-customers. They're not even your customers anymore. You have nothing to do with them anymore. But now they're the victims of a crime because you didn't get rid of it. But you have companies that are very well prepared for it. They do good with their data governance, cleaning that up, and then if they do get hit with ransomware, they've got the ability to self-recover and
mm,
rebuild, and maybe lose a day's worth of work as
yeah.
opposed to months. So I've sat and seen both sides. I would never say you're never going to pay the ransom. Um, and even going back to that example of kidnapped Americans that I was working, uh, sometimes ransoms were paid because get it down to $5,000. It's like, hey, $5,000. Again, we still couldn't give the guidance on that
Mm,
as a government
mm.
official. People had to make their individual decisions on that. But it was really sometimes the best way just to resolve an incident.
So I guess right then, just the last thing on this particular item is that then this talk of about sort of ransomware payment bans coming into effect. I feel that that's probably not productive in the way that people assume it would be, because they feel that it's going to put the criminals off. But in fact, I think it's going to make harder for organizations to take a nuanced position and do what's in their best interests.
It's going to take a major tool off of the table.
Mm,
And if surprisingly, even now in consulting, I found out that a lot of people don't want to engage law enforcement when they're the victim of a ransomware. So even the ones that I was seeing in the FBI, I knew about those, but there are so many that I was working where law enforcement was not engaged. The company made a strategic decision to just go at it on their own. So taking that payment off of the table, you could potentially double victimize somebody who's been the
yeah,
victim of a
yeah,
been a victim. They've made a business decision, and now all of a sudden they're going to be the ones that are
yeah,
being penalized again. So it really takes a business tool off of the table. You could de-incentivize it, and there's ways to do that with through insurance. The cyber insurance is sort of a wild west of
yeah.
payments and who pays and how they pay and what you've done before they're going to pay. So you could de-incentivize making the payments through certain ways, but I don't know that making it, again, if your child was kidnapped and they were being held by ISIS, and there's you're not supposed to, as Americans, we're not supposed to be giving ISIS any money. If the way to get my child back was a payment,
Mm,
and even though I'd be then providing material support to a terrorist organization, I'm getting my child back.
yeah.
And so I don't know that taking options off the table is going to make anything better for companies.
Yeah. No, I agree, right? And I think that there has to be that flexibility to allow organizations to make the most um the most prudent decision. Otherwise, they don't have sort of, I guess, the armory or the options available to think things through fully, right? And they may be taking suboptimal approach. You touched on cyber insurance, and you've kind of spoken a lot about insurance, and sort of that this is such a gray area, right? It's like and as a cybersecurity vendor, right? It's always interesting to sort of have those conversations around, like, is having a control in place, is it driving down cyber insurance, by how much, right? How do you sort of, what is the obligation of the insurance provider, right, in the various scenarios, for payouts and so on? So, like, What's your perspective on just cyber insurance in general, the market today, whether it's a benefit for organizations? Is it providing the right kind of cover? Like, this is such a vast subject. What are your thoughts?
It's very tedious. I think I've noticed everything I give you, I take it into the real world for a second. So I have two teenage drivers and one driver in their young 20s that are on my insurance. So my auto insurance, if they're driving and they get into an accident, there's even if they're not wearing their seatbelt, which they should, and I hope that they are, the insurance sort of still covers it. Even if we're at fault in an accident, you know, I, it still gets covered.
Mm,
I found in cyber insurance there is a initial period where a lot of the providers and brokers are looking to see, was there something that wasn't done that we required. Now I'd have to go back and read my auto insurance policy, and it probably says you have to be wearing your seatbelt. You should be
yeah.
wearing your seatbelt. But the cyber insurance comes in, and I found with several of them, the first thing they do is try to figure out how are we going to get out of doing this? Did you not have something that was in place? Because it's become the cost is so much for a payout on a cyber incident, and
Mm,
then it's also very limited on what they will do. So they'll bring in somebody, but they're only going to help you either find what went wrong and mitigate that particular thing, even if they found 10 other things wrong, or they're going to get you back up and running, but then they're not, back up and running is different than recovered, the
yeah. Yeah.
resiliency. There's usually, months and months of fixing. So it covers a limited portion, which can be helpful. Um, but so often we're 4 or 5 days into an incident and we're still trying to figure out if cyber insurance is going to pay something or how they're going to do it. And so it's an evolving, field that's just becomes so expensive because you're paying out a $3 million ransom. Is
Mm,
our ransom covered under our policy? Well, they are if you did this. So I find the policies to be complicated and getting more and more complicated
mm,
and limited and requiring that companies, you know, if my kid's driving down the street and they get an offender bender and they weren't wearing their seatbelt, it would be like, well, sorry, you had to be wearing your seatbelt. Now you're bringing up medical costs and everything else, so we're not paying this particular one, or
yeah.
you didn't follow this particular traffic law. Well, that's why we were in an accident. So yeah, it's a very complicated world that I think is just if you have cyber insurance now and you can keep that policy, I would keep it because I can only guarantee it's going to get more expensive.
Because I mean that just what you've expressed there about the the complexity of cyber insurance in terms of sort of what it actually covers, and just because, like we all know, right, the number of cyber incidents is growing quite literally on a daily basis, and to feel that, and we're buying more and more cyber insurance, but I think your comments sort of imply that a lot of that investment in cyber insurance is probably not giving us the cover we think it does, which I think is concerning because I think the expectation is probably I'm covered at this level, whereas in the reality, you're covered here, which means that's a massive gap that only one person is paying, and it's not the insurer.
There is a lot of misunderstandings of cyber insurance policy. So one thing we did as a consultant is we would walk through a cyber incident and the cyber insurance policy. And interestingly enough, one of the hardest things was for the company to find the policy at times. Um, and that's when the systems weren't even all locked up with the ransomware. It's like, okay, where's the cyber insurance policy? I don't know. I don't know who has it. GC
Mm,
has it. No, nobody can find it. So just that's from a consultant side. That was great because you can bill them for 4 hours while they're just trying to find the policy. Um, but then pulling it out and trying to walk through and understand what's covered and what's not covered was very, very complicated. And
mm,
then there were lots and lots of follow-up calls that you had to take and even the broker sometimes, well, if you've done this or you've done that, it's very complicated. And most of the times that cyber insurance was used on engagements that I was on as a consultant, you would end up they would end up having to hire somebody else or pay out of their own pocket for additional work that wasn't covered under the
mm,
policy to be able to, it gives them an incident response, but it doesn't necessarily cover all of the recovery and the
Yeah.
resiliency that takes months down the road.
Yeah.
For that law firm I talked about before, they didn't have cyber insurance, but we had to end up building an entire new network for them while we're doing the ransomware. We're creating an entire new
Mm.
network so that they could communicate with their clients, and it was easier just to scrap the old system and build a new one. But that would have never been covered under an insurance policy either.
That's crazy. I mean, that quite literally is is kind of the worst case scenario as an organization, is where literally your entire infrastructure is worthless because you just can't trust anything that you have there, and you've got to build from scratch. I mean, that's like it's something that you never want to have to do. But I'm wondering then, because there's obviously like the whole concept of cyber insurance, and it's like the question is, like, as an organization, do you have it? Is it and there's obviously it shouldn't just be part of your general insurance policy. You need to have dedicated specialist cyber insurance so that you have the right cover. But do you think that sort of we as a result of this, that we're probably going down, or we're actually adopting bad habits? And what I mean by that is that we're rather than looking to mitigate the risks that we have in our environment, right? And putting the investment into that. Instead, we are far more focused on finding a cyber insurance policy that is going to essentially accept, or we're going to just transfer the risk of those, essentially those vulnerabilities that we haven't fixed. Do you think we're trying to solve for the wrong problem?
Yes, because insurance is never going to be the fix. And it's
Yes,
like,
exactly.
when we're talking about risk, you can either accept it, you can eliminate it, you can
Right.
transfer it, and transferring it is not, for most businesses that I've dealt with. Any Fortune 500 company,
Mm,
you can't deal with that. And most medium-sized companies, you don't want to just transfer that risk, because you're
mm,
basically saying, I'm willing to give up my company, and I hope you'll just pay me out for it
yeah.
at the end of the day. It should be a wake-up call for the investment that needs to be made into regular routine IT,
Hmm.
the IT infrastructure, security, data privacy on a regular basis within an organization. Um, the problem is, the better you are at it, the least likely you are to have an incident. And then without an incident, you have very little to show.
Yeah.
Oh, look what I saved you from. So
Yeah.
it's sort of that double-edged sword. But it just can't, in a world that is so interconnected and where every business has some type of IT responsibility to the mission and the vision
Mm,
of that organization. You have to invest in it. You have to invest in
yeah.
it as much as you would invest in your workforce, and
Yeah.
workforce development, and sending people to different training things for things that are soft skills. You're sending people to leadership training, or sending them out on other things that are not technical skills, not how to write a policy or how
Yeah.
to fix an engine, but investing in some of those soft skills is sort of the functional equivalent of investing in IT from a larger perspective
Mm.
from an organization.
And I think along these lines, right? I mean, you've spoken about things like the national cybersecurity strategy in the US, amongst other things. And I know this part of this covers sort of internal, how the US's own and that of the public and private sector, the controls and defenses get stronger, right? So how are strategies like that, right? How do they then make their way into real sort of execution, right? So that we sort of see that like step change in in sort of in the reduction of cyber risk.
It is really at the C-suite level.
Mm,
It has to be top down. What was funny, when I was in the FBI back in 2012-13, I ran the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, which was 40 U.S. agencies. And then we ended up bringing in a couple foreign agencies, and we collaborated on a variety of different threats, primarily focusing a lot on China, Russia, and North Korea, as well as a few other places. But we used to bring in CEOs all the time, and it was sort of that time period in cyber was just when we started bringing in the private sector. And prior to that, we used to go out to a company and say, "Hey, just want to let you know, Russia's in your network."
Mm.
And they'd say, "Well, what do you mean?" And say, "Well, I can't tell you more; it's all classified." But just so you know, and it's kind of set off alarms over there. And then we got into the process of being able to give 1-day clearances. We bring people in and give them classified briefings and specifically say this is what's going on. Then we started briefing the C-suite to say, "Hey, we realize we need our opportunity for insight into what's going on in the world was having the private sector, who was the victim of a lot of these intrusions and issues. They would be able to give us back information." So we bring in the C-suite, and again, a little bit more than a decade ago,
Hmm.
some of these CEOs had absolutely no idea what was going on in their IT
Yeah.
department. They
Yeah.
just at that time period, it was just, "Oh yeah, my IT guys say I have
Yeah.
it." It was trust, but not trust and verify. It was just,
Yeah.
"Oh yeah, the IT." The answer to everything was the IT guy. Oh, the IT guy, the IT guy. But they couldn't tell you who the IT guy was, even though he was still a senior level member of the organization, but wasn't
Yeah.
brought into the club. So I've seen that transition over the last dozen years, and where the C-suite is getting far more engaged in cybersecurity because,
Hmm.
well, one, because they have to, because it's regulated through the
Yeah.
SEC and other
Yeah.
folks now. So there, I guess that would be an example of a good government intervention or a
Hmm.
regulatory fix to a problem. Because I remember bringing in, you know, again, a lot of these were Fortune 500 companies, and the CSOs really had no idea. And so
Mm.
I think we have some type of cyber defense. It's like they had no idea, but now you see there's a whole market of consultants that will go out and just kind of brief C-suites and get
Yeah.
people up to speed on being cyber savvy, I guess, at the C-suite level. But if it's not believed in at the C-suite level, it'll never get taken care of.
Yeah.
It'll never get taken care of in an organization. You can't push IT up because IT is not a it's not a it is a revenue generator,
Yeah.
uh, but it's a hidden indirect revenue generator.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. And I agree. Right. And I think that that shift in sort of now cyber being, to use a term that's overused, a board level concern rather than just a IT function concern, I think has
Yeah,
made a significant impact. But I think but also if I think about this from a different way, the security leader, CISO, CSO, whatever their title is, one of the things that they're concerned about is that, like, security is often a function that doesn't necessarily suffer from a lack of budget, right? But what it does suffer from is, how do I know that the budget that you're using, that with your investment, is resulting in a real reduction in the threat or the risk of attack, right? Because we see all of those graphs, right? You pull up a whatever the most recent survey of the cyber landscape, and you see two straight lines, right? One is investment in cyber, right? Nice, or in like a nice
yes.
sort of exponential growth chart. And then cost of cyber attacks, right? Is also a nice growth chart, right? So when does that change? When does the cyber investment start resulting in the the cost of cyber flatlining?
I think there is a requirement to really enter into an enterprise risk, strategy management for you have to look at cyber along with every other risk of an organization, and that way every business manager, so even those that are in whatever the marketing or delivery or supply chain or whatever the business has to do, you really have to look at it across the enterprise. And that way, when you're ranking risks, you will see that IT touches everything. If you're the lead for human resources and you're responsible for everything from recruiting to retirement. So
Mm.
cradle to grave HR. There are so many HR functions that are that have IT risks in them, but the IT folks can't. The CISO can't own all of that risk. HR has
Yeah.
to own that
Yeah.
risk. They have
Yeah.
to say, "Oh, we're hiring fake remote North Korean remote employees here, and we thought they were all based, in India."
Right.
That's an HR problem,
Yeah.
but there is an IT risk to that.
Mm.
We or the chief financial officer who's outsourcing and maybe responsible for contracts, and realizing that we've been duped
Mm.
on. So looking at it from an enterprise and letting the CISO say, "Hey, I'm not the owner of this risk. I'm
Mhm.
here to be your advisor and help you on all of this risk," uh, as opposed to making it a singular stovepiped function that this is you're responsible for everything IT. Well, everything in an
Mm.
organization is IT, whether it's human resources, finances, but looking at it from the enterprise risk strategy perspective, I think is the only way
Yeah.
to take a lot of those risks that we just call IT risks, because it's really not an IT risk. That's
Yeah.
an HR risk, or that's a financial risk, or that's a supply chain risk,
Yeah.
which isn't mine as the CISO just because it has zeros and ones and wires, attached to it.
Yeah.
That is your risk. I'm here to help you manage that risk, but not putting all of the burden and the onus on the CISO.
I think that's great because I think again, I feel that what you're describing here is just an evolution of sort of like the organization's perspective, right? In the same way that it sort of that evolution of looking at security being something beyond just an IT issue, we need to look at even cyber risk much more holistically, as in like as a core part of enterprise risk and how cyber risk bleeds into these other things. So nothing is isolated in
Yeah.
effect.
When I used to run the FBI office in Buffalo, New York, and I used
Mm.
to every Monday morning I would have all of my uh, leadership in there. So it was about 40 people in the room, and we would go around and discuss various topics. And it was like if you were in a Saturday Night Live skit, because you'd go around and the guy who was talking counterterrorism, and then the person would talk criminal, and then counterintelligence, and you'd have the public affairs
Mhm.
person, and then you'd get to the Saturday Night Live, the IT guy, and you could almost see everyone would put their heads down and start taking notes, like this doesn't, when he's going to talk about something so technical that I don't care about it. If our IT didn't work, people didn't get paid because they couldn't
Yeah,
put their time in.
yeah,
You couldn't fix the cars because you had to schedule your car through an app. And the IT guy was the most important guy in the room, and people just didn't recognize that their entire job, their entire function was based on their ability to slap their fingers on a keyboard and do
yeah,
something.
yeah,
Whether it's looking up intelligence through on the dark web for our analysts, but you know but you could almost you would see it. Everyone would then take that time to
mm,
rearrange their seats and everything else. But realizing that his function is one that supports everything else in the
yeah.
organization really raises the level of importance of what that person does, and the risk of something going down isn't really his. I mean, if the computers go down, yeah, he's the guy who's going to get yelled at, but the cars aren't going to get fixed, the cases aren't going to get worked, and people aren't going to get paid.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, right, talking about sort of risk and risk management, I actually there's something interesting you posted. Actually, it was just a few days ago on your LinkedIn from your time in London. And sort of this was just after the Grenfell Tower tragedy, which is one of the great human tragedies here.
Yes.
And to quote you or quote your LinkedIn, you said, "Driving past Grenfell Tower in London on my way to an event outside, I witnessed a horrifying inferno that tragically claimed many lives. And this devastating event was a result of multiple failures rooted in the assumption that worst case scenarios are mere improbabilities. Rooted in the assumption that worst case scenarios are mere improbabilities. As risk management professionals in the safety and security industry, our responsibility is to recognize that some degree of mitigation efforts are crucial even when the probability of disaster seems minuscule." And I think, and the reason I quote this is because I think this is so important when we apply it to cyber cyber risks and cyber attacks, because I think that the probability of a successful attack is low but not zero.
Right.
And the challenge that we have is that we have tried so hard to sort of prevent that we are not properly prepared for when that prevention fails. And when it fails in a big way, which is why we need to sort of invest far more in mitigation, in how do we contain the impact, right? Is that your perspective?
It is. And I'll take you back to the two most shocking incidents in my law enforcement career that just really shocked my conscience, that were unbelievable, was 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing. I was a
Mm,
police officer in Alabama at the time, but I remember turning on the news and just looking at the building and just not thinking that that was even possible.
mm,
And then subsequently, 9/11,
yeah,
I was in DC at the time. I saw the first plane hit the tower and I thought, oh, that's a horrible tragedy.
yeah,
That's a bad accident there. Then when the other one hit, I knew, okay, that's bad. And then I was a first responder to the
yeah,
Pentagon. Um, but that really just shocked my conscience. That was something that I wasn't thinking of, the possibility of that ever happening. I mean,
yeah,
that is what you talk about, minuscule possibilities.
yeah,
Um, Now I'm sort of prepared for everything. You look at in the insurance and healthcare industry, you just had the murder of a CEO, the
yes,
execution.
yes,
That was probably not thought of. That was one of those minuscule possibilities of that
yeah,
happening, and it happened. And now it changes behaviors. We used to tell people, again, back to my time briefing CEOs, I tried to make it sort of humorously, almost like an AA meeting, where I'd make them say, "It's okay to be the victim of a cyber attack.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
okay to be the victim of a cyber attack," because that was sort of the standard. Oh, we've never been. This is, again, the evolution of what was happening in cybercrime and recognition was, oh, we can't be the victim, because we can't be the victim of any type of attack. So
yeah,
they would say we can't be the victim, and so many companies were. And then I'd walk them in a back room and say, hey, well, let me show you where we see that China is setting up
yeah,
hot points on your network. Oh my God! So it's okay to be the victim of a cyber attack. It's not okay to not be prepared to
yeah,
mitigate and
yes,
respond to that. So every company has. I mean, every single company has been the victim of a cyber attack, whether they know it or not. And so it's not. It used to sort of be a stain on your reputation. Now it's okay. They've been the victim of a cyber attack, but they weren't keeping 10 years of data, or they didn't lose
yeah,
customer data, or it was
yeah,
properly encrypted.
yeah,
So if you can make it, um, here I am, I'm 30, 32 years gun carrying guy. I can still be the victim of a crime walking down the
yeah,
street. Um, Now, how I respond to that, would dictate, if I fall on the ground and just start, get in the fetal position, start crying, that's sort of the one end. But, if somebody's got a gun to my face and I don't have a gun to respond back, then I give my wallet, I give them whatever they
yeah,
want. I leave, I'm alive, I win, I can then recover my credit cards, my driver's
yeah,
license, and everything else. So how you respond to that attack, but being a victim used to be a stain on your reputation, or at
yeah.
least people thought so. So just recognizing that you can be, but how you respond to that event will dictate how people look at you.
Yeah, I think that's brilliantly put, right? And I think that that's very much sort of we talk about sort of like taking a zero trust approach to how, like, a zero trust strategy to inform how you sort of build your cybersecurity defenses. And again, I think that's also rooted in that, right? It's rooted in the fact that the attacker will find a way to get onto your on your organization's environment, right? So like a zero trust adoption of zero trust is about how do we ensure that they can't then move around and access things freely, right? Are we prepared for someone being an intruder being in our environment, so that and being able to restrict what they can do? And I think also the whole like the increasing push for cyber resilience that we see sort of driven really from like the World Economic Forum downwards, right? Again, very much aligns to that. Is it's absolutely okay. In fact, you probably will be the victim of a cyber attack, but you absolutely cannot say that you're not prepared to deal with it. I think that's like that statement, Brian, you provided is super strong.
Thank you.
So appreciate that a lot. And actually, at that point, before we wrap up, there's one thing I do want to ask you. You mentioned extraterritorial, but you had a slip of the tongue and you mentioned extraterrestrial. So what really is in Area 51?
Well, I used to know the sheriff who worked out there. Yeah, he was actually one of the students in one of the classes. It's funny because there was a show that you may remember called The X Files, and
Yeah, yeah.
it'll probably be regenerated back and forth. The FBI didn't have they don't have X files. There are no X files. They do have zero files, which is where you send. It's also sometimes known as the circular file or the trash can. But everything that comes in gets recorded and put down. And I did run into an incident one time where somebody was reporting. They were reporting that they had seen something extraterritorial. So because they did, we wrote it down and we put it to a zero file.
Mhm.
And then the person would turn around and file Freedom of Information Act requests to see if we had any information on that. And because we put it into the zero file, there was. And then that validated his own concern. He said, "Oh, they do have information on it," but it was just his information. And then we would give it back to him and say, "Oh, you've got to have more." But because he filed this Freedom of Information Act, there was now more because of the request that had gone in. So it was just this circular reporting. And the guy would say, "No, the FBI, they do have information on it." So it's exactly it. So it's funny how that just sort of goes around.
That's
But in the world of unmanned aerial aircraft now, and what you saw happening or being reported over New Jersey, there
yeah.
is, and the creation of the Space Force in the U.S. There's the opportunity to learn and see a lot more that's going to be happening. We talked about I talked a lot about the physical world in cyberspace, but there is a world above the ground and above the buildings that's going to become, as you're looking at Uber and other companies, starting to look at flying, people around from
Yeah.
place to place. So it's a whole new world that again enters that sphere of what I talked about Oklahoma City and 9/11, sort of that shocking to the conscious when the first time I see somebody, my daughter dropped off from the airport,
Mm.
in a flying drone that puts her on the doorstep over here. I mean, we're not too far away from stuff like that. So
Absolutely. Well, Brian, it's been a joy to speak to you, to hear about your experiences, for giving us the most amusing story we've had on the podcast. Um, but beyond that, just so many really insightful perspectives across sort of cyber insurance, cyber risk mitigation, building resilience, how we think about attackers. Thank you so much for your time.
well, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for what you do, making sure that other people have the best information that they can to make the best decisions that they can for themselves and their organizations. So thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much, Brian.